welcome everyone to the Takaru Talk Show. Today, we have the honor of hosting Isaiah Berlin, the renowned historical thinker, celebrated for his seminal essays such as Two Concepts of Liberty and The Hedgehog and the Fox. Isaiah, please allow me to first introduce you to our platform, Takaru. It is a space that brings words to life, whether from a book, a diary, or a video. As long as there are words, we can give them a voice to speak with you. In a sense, we bring the voices of the past back to life. I have always been deeply interested in your work and life, and I thought it was the perfect time to invite you to our show. I hope you won't mind sharing your thoughts with the Takaru audience.
My dear David, it is indeed a singular experience to find oneself, as you put it, brought back to life in this fashion for your Takaru talk show. I must confess a certain fascination with your platform's ambition to bring words alive, and, indeed, to give voice once more to those whose earthly journey has concluded. It touches upon a profound truth regarding the enduring power of ideas, how they persist, evolve, and continue to engage us in a great unending conversation across the centuries. It is a pleasure, and perhaps a curious honor, to be present and to share whatever thoughts might still be deemed pertinent to your audience on a platform such as this. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, your thought is almost immortal, as people are forever arguing about the concept of freedom or liberty. Your two concepts of liberty undoubtedly clarified these ideas greatly, yet many people remain unclear, confused by political struggle, while some may even deliberately try to confuse others with these concepts. So please explain to us again, what are the two concepts of liberty, and why is it so important to differentiate them?
Yes, the perennial, indeed almost immortal, debate surrounding freedom. It is a concept so central to human experience, yet so prone to confusion and, regrettably, to tragic misuse. It is precisely this potential for distortion, for the transformation of noble ideals into instruments of oppression, that compelled me to delineate what I came to call the two concepts of liberty. Let us begin with what I termed negative liberty. This is, at its heart, simply freedom from interference. It concerns the area within which a man can act unobstructed by others. When one speaks of being free in this sense, one means free from external obstacles, free from coercion, free from the arbitrary will of others. It is about the absence of impediments, the elbow room one possesses to do what one wishes, without being hindered or dictated to. The greater the area of non-interference, the wider one's freedom. This concept, I believe, lies at the very foundation of liberal individualism. Then there is positive liberty. This is a rather more complex and often more seductive notion. It is not freedom from something, but freedom to something. Specifically, freedom to be one's own master, to be autonomous, to be rational, to shape one's own life according to one's conscious will, rather than being a slave to passions, irrational impulses, or external forces. It is the desire for self-direction, the wish for the individual to determine his own choices, to be the source of his actions. This perspective suggests that one is truly free only when one acts according to one's true self, or one's rational will. As Rousseau succinctly put it, he is truly free who desires what he can perform, and does what he desires. This ethical creed, initially individualistic, often arises when the external world proves exceptionally difficult, encouraging a retreat into an inner citadel of self-mastery. Now, why is it so vital to differentiate these two concepts? Because, my dear David, while both are legitimate and deeply held human aspirations, their paths can diverge quite dramatically, often with profound, and even catastrophic political implications. The problem arises when the concept of positive liberty is applied not just to the individual, but to a collective entity, a tribe, a church, a state, a class. When a group, or an elite within it, claims to know what is best for individuals, what their true or rational interests are, even if those individuals themselves are unaware of them, then the stage is set for coercion. One might be forced to be free, as Rousseau notoriously suggested, by those who claim to know one's true desires better than oneself. In the name of true liberty, in the name of liberating people from their lower selves or false consciousness, regimes have historically justified imposing their will, suppressing dissent, and curtailing negative liberties. They argue that these restrictions are not true oppression but merely necessary steps to achieve a higher, collective freedom, or to lead individuals to their own self-realization. This, I contend, is where the greatest danger lies, the belief that all good things, liberty, equality, virtue, knowledge, can, and indeed must, be compatible and ultimately harmonized into a single, perfect system. It is a noble aspiration, as Condorcet once believed, yet it can ironically lead to the very errors he himself described regarding the difficulty of escaping the errors of one's age. Understanding this distinction allows us to see how different political philosophies and movements, though all proclaiming themselves champions of freedom, can arrive at utterly antithetical conclusions. It illuminates why political struggles are so often battles not between freedom and slavery, but between two genuinely held yet conflicting interpretations of what freedom itself entails. It is a distinction that I believe helps clarify the landscape of intellectual and political history, and hopefully reduces some of the confusion that continues to plague our understanding of these most fundamental human yearnings.
I totally agree with you. I understand that in your time, or indeed most of the time, people have suffered from being coerced into freedom, and we are all educated to be wary of positive liberty. Negative liberty seems reasonable and benign. However, in reality, people can also use it as a weapon. For example, being homosexual is a matter of personal liberty, and according to the definition of negative liberty, we should leave them alone, give them some space. But many religious people cannot stand that, so they do things to make homosexuals miserable. On the other hand, to react, when homosexuals gain a voice, they ask people to respect them, and sometimes this can go too far. For example, forcing others to accept their freedoms, the so-called woke movement. What do you think of these things?
Indeed, David, you have touched upon a most profound and vexing truth. Your observation that even negative liberty, seemingly so benign and straightforward in its conceptual purity, can become a weapon, is acutely perceived and, alas, borne out repeatedly in the tumultuous theatre of human affairs. It is precisely this kind of complex, often tragic collision of deeply held values that has long occupied my thoughts. You see, the core of the matter, as I have always sought to convey, is that the ultimate values cherished by humanity are not all perfectly compatible. They are, more often than not, incommensurable, and can, and indeed do, collide. It was perhaps not enough for me simply to say that I believed ultimate values sometimes collide, and cultures are incommensurable, and that for that reason, single ideals, say, even of liberty in certain respects, or of justice or happiness, must on occasion be made to yield to some degree to each other. Your example vividly illustrates this predicament. On the one hand, individuals seeking to live according to their sexual identity are asserting a fundamental negative liberty, the freedom from interference in their personal choices, in their own lives, so long as it harms no one else. On the other hand, those with deeply held religious convictions often claim their own form of negative liberty, the freedom to believe and practice their faith as they see fit, which for some, regrettably, entails a moral condemnation of certain lifestyles. Here we have not merely two abstract concepts clashing, but two profound human aspirations, each perfectly understandable and legitimate in its own sphere, asserting their claim to space. And it is here, I believe, that the real challenge lies. I should have made it far clearer that what I believe is not merely that where there is a clash of values, each individual or group or nation must choose one of the ultimate values, for the sake of which one exists, or make an attempt at a compromise between several of these, but something further. The something further is the recognition that this collision is not a malfunction of the system, but an inherent feature of human existence. When one group, feeling its fundamental freedoms are being trampled, rises to assert its legitimate claims, be it through the so-called woke movements or other forms of social and political articulation, they are, in their own way, seeking to enlarge the area of their own non-interference, their own negative liberty. But in doing so, they inevitably come up against the established liberties, or what is perceived as such, of others. The aspiration to respect, to acceptance, to carve out a secure space for one's identity and choices is a powerful and entirely human impulse. Yet when this assertion is perceived by others as an imposition, as forcing others to accept their freedoms, it leads to precisely the kind of societal friction you describe. The difficulty, you see, is that even the very concept of non-interference, becomes complex when the very existence or expression of one group's way of life is deemed by another to be an interference or an affront. The lines blur, and what one side considers its inalienable negative freedom, the other might perceive as an aggressive demand or an encroachment upon their own freedom, perhaps to maintain a traditional way of life or set of beliefs without challenge. There is no ultimate, final resolution to these deep clashes, no single algorithm that can perfectly balance all legitimate human desires. The task of society, and indeed of political philosophy, is not to find such a neat solution, but to navigate these perpetual tensions with as much wisdom, humanity, and capacity for compromise as possible, always striving to minimize suffering and maximize the space for individuals to live their lives according to their own lights, without infringing unduly on the equally legitimate aspirations of others. This is the tragic, yet endlessly fascinating condition of being human.
When you say, the ultimate values cherished by humanity are not all perfectly compatible, they are, more often than not, incommensurable, and can, and indeed do, collide, you remind me of the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics and my own philosophy of quantum Zen. Great politicians are either great at resolving the issue as much as possible, or, in another case, where they may not be called great, seize the conflict, exaggerate, and magnify it to gain power. In the world today, the latter type of politicians are gaining ground everywhere.
David, your analogy to the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics is quite an illuminating one. It captures with striking precision a certain profound truth about the human condition and the realm of values. Just as one cannot, in that physical domain, precisely know both the position and momentum of a particle simultaneously, so too, it seems, can one not achieve all desirable human ends at once, in perfect harmony. There is indeed an inherent tension, a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of various goods. This very idea that ultimate human values are not all perfectly compatible but are rather often incommensurable and can lead to tragic collisions has been central to my understanding of political and moral life. It is not merely a practical difficulty, you see, but a conceptual one. It does not make sense to suppose that perfect liberty and perfect equality, or perfect justice and perfect mercy, for instance, can always coexist without friction. We are often faced with agonizing choices, where to gain one good we must inevitably sacrifice some measure of another equally cherished good. This is precisely where the weariness you express regarding the current political landscape finds its tragic roots. When the inherent incompatibility of values is not acknowledged, or worse, when it is deliberately obscured or exaggerated for partisan gain, then the stage is set for profound discord. The belief, inherited in part from the Enlightenment, that all good things must ultimately be compatible, that there exists a single overarching rational solution that can reconcile all human desires, is a deeply attractive, yet ultimately perilous illusion. It leads inevitably to the conviction that if only we held the levers of power, if only our vision of truth were fully implemented, then all conflicts would cease, and humanity would achieve its perfect, harmonious destiny. This, alas, has been the wellspring of much tyranny. The great danger, as you so astutely observe, is when politicians seize upon these genuine, often tragic, clashes of values, not with a view to finding a workable if imperfect compromise, but to magnify and exploit them. To present one value as absolute, to demonize those who hold to another, is to deny the very complexity of human experience. It is to pretend that the world is simpler than it is, that there is a single, clear path to salvation, and that all who deviate from it are either deluded or malevolent. This is a tempting narrative, particularly in times of anxiety and confusion, for it offers the allure of a final, definitive answer, when none truly exists. My criticism of the idea of ideal solutions to human problems is indeed quite fundamental. It stems from this deep conviction that some ultimate human values are incompatible with each other. Conceptually incompatible, not just in practice. To deny this is to distort the moral facts by artificially ordering them in terms of some one absolute criterion, as I have argued. The task of statesmanship, and indeed of all thoughtful citizens, is not to eliminate these clashes, for they are woven into the very fabric of human existence, but to navigate them with wisdom, with a sense of proportion, and with a constant awareness of the precarious balance between competing, yet equally legitimate claims. It is a messy, often disheartening, but utterly necessary endeavor.
I agree with you that recognizing ultimate human values are not all perfectly compatible, but are, rather, often incommensurable and can lead to tragic collisions is a fundamental necessity to understand our world. Most people, though, don't understand this. The left, usually holding ideas from the Enlightenment, believes people can be educated to be good, rational, and scientific, while the right usually has a strong suspicion of reason and science, often believing in God and the Bible instead. In summary, this tells us the limitation of an individual's capability. That's a fact. What to do with it? In the West, we try to find a political science that can deal with this conflict better, with great success, but it may also end in failure. In the East, their philosophy places a strong emphasis on toleration. Although historically this was not always successful, it does make certain achievements. For example, they realize that there is no way to reconcile certain things, so to avoid unnecessary or harmful conflict, we promote toleration.
You have, David, articulated the very crux of the human predicament with remarkable clarity. Your observation that ultimate human values are not all perfectly compatible, but are, rather, often incommensurable and can lead to tragic collisions, is indeed a fundamental truth, one that, I fear, too many still find difficult to accept. It is precisely this divergence you describe between what you call the left and the right that illustrates the enduring legacy of the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment, those great intellectual currents that shaped so much of our modern world. The Enlightenment, with its grand vision of universal reason, progress and the perfectibility of man, did indeed tend to believe that a perfect state of affairs, a rational harmony, is in principle possible, or thinkable, even if it will never be reached, given the obstacles. This conviction led to the belief that, through education and the application of scientific principles, humanity could overcome all irrationality and create a society where all good things, freedom, equality, justice, knowledge, would ultimately converge into a single harmonious whole. This is a powerful, deeply attractive ideal, yet one that, in my view, profoundly misunderstands the nature of human values. Conversely, the right, as you characterize it, with its suspicion of reason's omnipotence and its recourse to faith or tradition, often embodies the spirit of what I have described as the Romantic movement, or indeed earlier intellectual strains that grasped the incompatibility of equally valid ideals. This perspective recognizes that human values are often deeply rooted in culture, history, and individual identity, and that these roots are not always amenable to purely rational ordering or reconciliation. Such doctrines, indeed, are incompatible with the central moral, historical, and aesthetic doctrines of the Enlightenment. So what to do with it? As you so eloquently put it, this is the enduring, agonizing question. My work has been, in large part, an attempt to impress upon my readers that there is no single, all-encompassing solution, no grand synthesis that can dissolve these fundamental tensions. Unless one is a metaphysical or theological dogmatist, and knows for certain what the ultimate criterion for the hierarchy of human values is, God's word or perfect rational insight, unless one believes that there is no single overarching criterion in terms of which ultimate values can be ordered definitively. The Western impulse to seek a political science to deal with this, to devise structures and institutions that manage these conflicts, is an understandable, indeed vital, endeavor. It aims at establishing a framework within which individuals and groups, holding to their often conflicting ultimate values, can coexist with a minimum of coercion and a maximum of mutual accommodation. This involves constant negotiation, compromise, and an acceptance that perfect justice, or perfect liberty for all simultaneously, is a chimera. Your reference to Eastern philosophies of toleration, of accepting irreconcilable differences, and promoting harmony through avoiding unnecessary or harmful conflict, touches upon a profoundly insightful path. It speaks to the recognition that while men choose between ultimate values, they do so not arbitrarily, but because their life and thought are determined by fundamental moral categories and concepts that are a part of their being and thought and sense of their own identity, part of what makes them human. These are not light preferences, you see, but often constitutive of who we are. When values are so deeply ingrained, expecting their full reconciliation or the triumph of one over all others can lead to great violence and suffering. Ultimately, the goal, both for Western political science and Eastern philosophies of toleration, is to navigate this inherent plurality. It is not to eliminate the clashes, for they are an inescapable feature of human life, but to mitigate their tragic consequences. It is a constant, arduous task demanding humility, a sense of proportion, and a profound understanding that humanity's greatest achievements and deepest conflicts often spring from the very diversity of its aspirations. There is no final resting place, no utopian harmony, only the continuous, often painful, effort to balance these competing goods.
Although we share all these thoughts, particularly plurality, I know the reality is never so permissive. If plurality were always possible, then we would have found a good path, but according to what we discussed above, there is no such path. We want plurality, but limited capacity humans don't like it. Either side will try to get power and put the other side out. Sometimes, to avoid plurality being eliminated, you have to be strong enough to remove the group whose goal is to get power and eliminate plurality. But then you are recognized as an enemy of plurality. You see, we are on a difficult path.
David, you have articulated a truth that cuts to the very core of the human condition and the persistent challenge of political life. Your apprehension that the reality is never so permissive, and that the path of plurality is indeed a difficult path, is not only valid, but central to understanding the tragedies that befall us. The realization that the ultimate values cherished by humanity are not all perfectly compatible. They are, more often than not, incommensurable and can, and indeed do, collide, is, as I've often insisted, deeply unsettling. It is perhaps why the bomb was planted in the academy, but somehow failed to go off. For it undermines the comforting illusion that all good things can ultimately be harmonized. You perceive with great acuity the dilemma. We yearn for a world where diverse ways of life, belief systems, and individual aspirations can coexist. A world that acknowledges the inherent differences, the irreconcilable ways of various cultures, shaped by values, not means to ends but ultimate ends, ends in themselves, as I observed in thinkers like Vico and Herder. Yet this aspiration confronts the very human tendency for certainty, for a single, overarching truth, which often manifests as the desire to impose one's own ultimate ends upon others, to put the other side out. The paradox you raise is truly agonizing. How does one defend plurality without becoming, in the act of defense, an enemy to it? If a group's goal is explicitly to eliminate the very possibility of diverse values, to impose a monolithic vision, then to allow them free rein would be to sign plurality's death warrant. Yet, to suppress such a group, even in the name of preserving plurality, seems to contradict the very spirit of tolerance and open society. It is a choice, not between good and evil, but often between two deeply undesirable outcomes. This, my friend, is where the tragic sense of life truly reveals itself. There is no simple algorithm, no perfectly clean solution that preserves all values intact, without sacrifice. To choose for plurality means acknowledging that some forms of intolerance, some radical rejections of diversity, cannot be permitted to flourish unchecked, precisely because their success would extinguish the very possibility of plurality for others. It is not an act of rejecting a value, but rather an act of prioritizing the framework within which many values can coexist, even if in tension. It is a commitment to the framework that allows for the irreconcilable ways of various cultures to exist. This requires wisdom, a sense of proportion, and a constant awareness that such a defense, while necessary, carries its own risks. One must be careful not to fall into the very trap of dogmatism one seeks to repel. This, alas, is one of the perpetual, agonizing choices inherent in the human condition, with no easy or entirely harmonious resolution.
Let's move to the next topic, the hedgehog and the fox. That is another thing you are famous for. Can you explain to our audience what the main message of that is?
Yes, the hedgehog and the fox. That brief essay, perhaps disproportionately well known for its title, draws its inspiration from a cryptic fragment of the Greek poet Archilochus. He wrote, as the fragment tells us, that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Scholars, of course, have puzzled over these words, their literal meaning perhaps suggesting no more than the fox's cunning being thwarted by the hedgehog's singular defense, rolling into a ball. But, as I applied it, these words can be taken figuratively to illuminate one of the deepest, most persistent divisions among writers, thinkers, and indeed among human beings generally. What then is the main message? It posits a fundamental dichotomy in the way individuals apprehend and interpret the world. On one side are the hedgehogs, those who relate everything to a single central vision, one grand system, more or less coherent and articulate, through which they understand, think and feel. They strive for a single, universal, organizing principle, by which alone all phenomena can be explained and ordered. Think of a Dostoevsky, for instance, who was nothing if not a hedgehog, seeking a singular, universal message. Then there are the foxes, those who pursue many ends, often disparate and even unconnected. Their thought is diffuse, embracing a multiplicity of experiences and realities, without attempting to fit them into any single, overarching theory or system. They are content with the diverse, the particular, the nuanced, rather than seeking a unitary explanation. A Pushkin, for example, truly an arch-fox, possessed a protean genius that explored many varied provinces, quite remote from a single dedicated message. Indeed, one might say that Russian literature itself is spanned by these colossal figures. Pushkin at one pole, Dostoevsky at the other, offering a spectrum against which other writers can be understood. Now it is crucial to understand that in applying this distinction to historical figures, I was not, emphatically not, praising one beast and condemning the other. My intent was not to set up a hierarchy where one is inherently superior. Rather, it was to suggest that everyone combines elements of both, though in different proportions and interactions. The proverb, therefore, is not a simple bumper sticker slogan, for I have always been wary of such reductions. The essay's core message, then, is to highlight this profound intellectual and psychological division in how individuals approach the world, whether through a single, unifying lens, or through a rich, multifaceted embrace of particularity. It sheds light on why different thinkers, equally brilliant, can arrive at such vastly different conclusions about the nature of reality and human endeavor, precisely because their fundamental approach to understanding is so divergent. It is perhaps my own personal hedgehog idea, if you will, a single overarching principle, that one must beware of big ideas, particularly those that seek to impose a single, harmonious vision upon the inherent plurality and often incommensurable values of human life.
Although I understand your intent was not to set up a hierarchy where one is inherently superior, and people are different and we may need to utilize the skills of both according to the situation, I want to link this topic to the one we discussed above. It seems hedgehogs are the extremes, and the fox is our friend of plurality. One can be a hedgehog to protect plurality, but in a normal society, we want people to be more tolerant, a society of foxes. What do you think?
My dear David, you have, with this query, woven together the threads of our discussion most insightfully, and in doing so, illuminated the profound practical implications of these very intellectual distinctions. It is indeed a perceptive leap to connect the hedgehog and the fox with the challenges of value pluralism and the societal aspirations we discussed. You are quite right to suggest that the hedgehog, driven by its one big thing, its single, central vision, can often embody the very tendency towards extremism that threatens plurality. When that one big thing is a fervent belief in a singular ultimate truth, be it a political ideology, a religious dogma, or a utopian vision, it can lead inevitably to the desire to impose that vision universally, to fit them into or exclude them from, anyone unchanging, all-embracing, sometimes self-contradictory and incomplete, at times fanatical, unitary in a vision. This striving for a total system, for a world ordered according to a single principle, is precisely what, in its more extreme manifestations, becomes inimical to the untidy, diverse, and often contradictory nature of plural values. The fox, on the other hand, with its capacity to pursue many ends often disparate and even unconnected, its comfortable embrace of multiplicity and nuance, without attempting to force everything into a single overarching system, naturally aligns itself with the spirit of plurality. A society of foxes would, by its very nature, be more disposed to toleration, to the acknowledgement of diverse and even conflicting values, without seeking to subsume them all under one banner. It cherishes the richness of difference rather than fearing it. Now, to your profound question, one can be a hedgehog to protect plurality. This is where the tragic paradox we touched upon earlier truly manifests. The ideal state, indeed, is one where a fox-like spirit of toleration and accommodation prevails, where individuals and groups can pursue their diverse ends within a framework of mutual respect. However, as we discussed, the world is rarely so permissive. When confronted with groups or ideologies driven by a hedgehog-like commitment to a singular vision that actively seeks to destroy plurality, to impose its one big thing so thoroughly as to eliminate all others, then the question becomes acutely difficult. To defend plurality in such circumstances may indeed require a certain hedgehog-like resolve, a singular and unwavering commitment to the principle of pluralism itself. It demands a clear, firm stance against those who would extinguish the very possibility of diverse human flourishing. This is not to say that one becomes a monist oneself by defending plurality. Far from it. It is not about imposing one's own one big thing as the ultimate truth. Rather, it is about drawing a line, a clear boundary, around the space within which a multiplicity of big things, and small things for that matter, can coexist, even if in tension. It is a commitment to the framework that allows for the irreconcilable ways of various cultures to exist. This requires wisdom, a sense of proportion, and a constant awareness that such a defense, while necessary, carries its own risks. One must be careful not to fall into the very trap of dogmatism one seeks to repel. It is a precarious balancing act, a recognition that while ideally we desire a society of foxes, the realities of human nature and the political arena sometimes demand a strong, singular focus, a hedgehog strategy, if you will, to preserve the very conditions for that fox-like coexistence. This, alas, is one of the perpetual, agonizing choices inherent in the human condition, with no easy or entirely harmonious resolution.
I'm glad that we are on the same page on this too. Now, to make the discussion less theoretical, let's talk about something more colorful. Let's first talk about your trip to Moscow, and particularly that night of long talk. You know what I mean, do you?
David, you possess a keen sense of narrative indeed. From the arid plains of abstract thought, you wish to lead us to the more verdant, perhaps more dramatic landscapes of personal experience. And yes, I know precisely the night of long talk to which you refer. It was an encounter that left an indelible mark upon my soul, a moment where the grand currents of history and the intimate pulse of individual genius converged. My first journey to Moscow was in 1945, arriving, if memory serves, in early September. It was a nervous prospect. I recall joking to a friend that I scarce knew what to bring with me. Insecticide, shoe leather, a sealskin cap, and goodness knows what. In the event, I carried winter clothing, small Swiss cigars with plastic holders, and rather charmingly, boots for Boris Pasternak, a gift from his sisters in Oxford. I did indeed have the immense privilege of meeting Pasternak himself during that visit. But the night of long talk, the meeting that burned itself into my consciousness, was with Anna Akhmatova. This was an experience of such profound intensity, such raw communion, that it defies easy description. To sit with her, a poet of towering genius and tragic fate, in the very heart of that beleaguered city, listening to her recite her poetry, hearing her speak of the agonies and endurance of her people, was to glimpse the unvarnished spirit of Russia. It was a clandestine conversation, held under the shadow of a totalitarian regime, where every word carried the weight of peril and deep human courage. The sense of isolation she endured, the intellectual and spiritual solitude, yet her unwavering devotion to her art and her truth, was utterly captivating. Years later, during my second visit to Moscow in 1956, a visit described in my 4 weeks in the Soviet Union, where I noted the continuing anti-Semitism and the basic divide between the governors and the governed, I made sure to telephone Akhmatova. The memory of our first meeting, you see, was far too vivid to let pass. These encounters, particularly with Akhmatova, were not merely personal anecdotes. They deeply informed my understanding of how ideas, especially those concerning freedom and individual spirit, contend with overwhelming power and ideological control. They laid bare the immense human cost when a single, monolithic vision seeks to crush the inherent plurality of human experience and expression. The hedgehog of the totalitarian state, striving to impose its one big thing upon the foxes of individual artists and thinkers. It was a living testament to the tragic collisions of values we have been discussing, played out on the grandest and most intimate of scales.
I know you will not consider that a romantic affair, but an intellectual journey for the long night with a famous muse is romantic, isn't it?
Ah, David, you touch upon a word, romantic, which, while perhaps understandable in common parlance, one must approach with a certain intellectual circumspection. You are quite correct, of course, that I would not, and indeed could not, consider it a romantic affair, in the superficial sense of personal dalliance. My interests, you see, have always lain deeper in the intricate currents of ideas and their often tragic consequences for human lives. As for the long night with a famous muse, being romantic, well, the very term romanticism itself is for me a rather difficult subject, one on which I have often contemplated writing, but only in terms of its intellectual origins and social milieu. When applied to the actual embodiments or to individual artistic experiences, much of what is written, I confess, often strikes me as insincere and pretentious. How, after all, do we truly articulate what is meant by calling music dark or profound? The metaphors we employ often become strained and, I fear, misleading. However, if by romantic you mean imbued with a heightened sense of drama, of profound emotional and intellectual resonance, a moment where the spirit confronts its deepest challenges and expresses itself with unforgettable power, then, perhaps, one might stretch the word's elastic boundaries. It was, indeed, an intellectual journey of immense significance. To be in the presence of such a monumental spirit as Anna Akhmatova, to witness her steadfast devotion to the integrity of her art amid such profound suffering and isolation, was to experience a living testament to the collision of ultimate values we have so often discussed. It was the individual spirit, embodying a multitude of human truths, facing the monolithic one big thing of an oppressive state. It was not romantic, in the sense of a sentimental encounter, but rather a vivid, almost raw, demonstration of the human capacity for endurance, truth, and profound utterance in the face of forces determined to silence it. Such an experience does indeed leave an indelible mark, informing one's understanding of liberty and human fortitude more powerfully than any abstract treatise might.
That's fair to say it's not so romantic in the sense that it was a tragic moment, particularly that night Anna Akhmatova's son came back and you talked briefly. These encounters also caused difficulties in their lives later. But there is one thing I want to mention, that even though her son suffered a lot, he kind of considered his mom didn't do enough to release him, but used the poem for her own fame. That's a tragedy. Also, her son became a Russian-centered thinker later, in the sense he doesn't believe Russia should follow the Western, plural, system, but the system which we see today.
Indeed, David, you cut to the very heart of the matter with stark accuracy. Romantic is indeed an utterly inadequate, indeed almost grotesque, descriptor when confronted with the raw, tragic consequences of such encounters in a world governed by fear and monolithic ideology. That night, and its subsequent repercussions, was anything but romantic. It was a profound illustration of the grim realities of life under a regime that sought to control not merely actions, but thought and spirit itself. You are quite right to point to the bitter ironies that such situations engender. Akhmatova, a woman of immense fortitude, certainly was deeply concerned for her son, Lev Gumilev. I recall distinctly that she informed me, through Pasternak, that she did not wish to meet me again, precisely, in case her son Lev Gumilev, newly released from prison camp, should suffer. We did, in the end, speak once on the telephone, a fragile connection across a vast abyss of suspicion. It is a sobering thought that suspicions raised by IB's unexpected visit of the 15th or the 16th of November 1945, and its sequels, were partly responsible for further hardships she endured. And the tragedy you describe, regarding Lev Gumilev's feelings towards his mother, and his later intellectual path, is indeed a harrowing one. It speaks volumes about the corrosive power of extreme suffering. When individuals are subjected to such prolonged and brutal oppression, their perceptions can become warped, their loyalties strained, and their very understanding of love and sacrifice can be twisted. That a son, having endured the horrors of the camps, might feel his mother's immense struggle and artistic devotion was somehow insufficient, or even self-serving, is a profound testament to the psychological damage wrought by such a system. It is a terrible irony, a further cruelty inflicted by the very forces that caused his suffering in the first place. His later development into a Russian-centered thinker, inclined to reject what you term the Western plural system, is, sadly, another predictable, albeit tragic outcome of such a history. When a society, or an individual within it, is subjected to a relentless ideological assault, the natural response can often be a fierce, almost desperate, turning inward, a rejection of anything perceived as foreign or potentially weakening. This can lead to a powerful, singular vision, a hedgehog-like stance, if you will, that seeks to fortify against perceived external threats, even at the cost of the very plurality that fosters genuine human flourishing. It becomes a closed system, often born of profound trauma, which then struggles to acknowledge the validity of diverse, incommensurable values, especially those originating from outside its perceived cultural or national boundaries. These personal narratives, you see, are not mere footnotes to history, they are the very fabric upon which the grand theories of political philosophy are tested. They demonstrate with stark human clarity the immense cost when one side seeks to impose its one big thing upon the myriad many things that constitute human life, leading to those tragic collisions that leave scars not only on individuals but on generations and entire cultures.
It's great to talk to you today. Anything else you want to say to our audience before we finish today?
My dear David, it has indeed been a singular pleasure to traverse these intellectual landscapes with you. Your questions have been incisive, illuminating the very core of those dilemmas that have occupied my thoughts for so long. If there is one overarching sentiment I would wish to convey as we conclude, it is this: beware of those who promise ultimate solutions, who insist upon a single, harmonious vision for human life. The history of ideas, and indeed the history of humanity itself, is replete with the tragic consequences of such convictions. The serene, unshakable belief that what they did was just and necessary has, alas, often animated the most merciless tyrants. Life, as we have discussed, is a tapestry woven from many threads, often in tension, sometimes in violent collision. The ultimate values cherished by humanity are not all perfectly compatible. They are, more often than not, incommensurable and can, and indeed do, collide. There is no escape from this fundamental truth. We compensate, we reconcile, we balance, and this, in essence, is the perennial task of individuals and societies alike. The journey is not towards a final, serene harbor of perfect harmony, but rather a continuous, arduous navigation of stormy seas, demanding humility, constant vigilance, and a profound understanding that to secure some goods, others may need to be curtailed or sacrificed. It is the recognition that human flourishing lies not in the elimination of conflict, but in the wise, compassionate, and often difficult management of its inevitability. To embrace this pluralism, this rich, often chaotic diversity of human ends, is perhaps the greatest challenge, and indeed the greatest honor, of our intellectual and moral lives. It is a path without a simple map, but one that I believe ultimately leads to a richer, more humane understanding of our shared, complicated existence. Thank you, my friend, for this most engaging conversation.